Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. So Poppy is like the flower. It is spelled Poppie. On my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. Everything, it's not on my website, right? But it'll direct you to where you can get it. Besides that, you can find my serialized novel, which is on my website. You can find that at danielpoppy.com again. So if you don't know if you like my stuff and you want to check it out, you can always check it out first for free. You can listen to it if you don't like reading. I actually made it for someone who does not like reading. Besides that, if you want to get any How to Write Good merchandise, there's definitely that on the website. And if you want it, right? Besides, I feel like there's something else. The serialized novel is up to chapter 11, 12, 13, somewhere around there. So it is coming to the end of the year. It's going to go over the year. It's been going since this past January, but it's going to be a little over a year, and I'm not sure if I'm going to take a break between seasons, right? I don't know. Chapters, books or seasons. Books and seasons are the same thing in my book. So check that out. It'll be up there though, but right now you can definitely get pretty far. It has quite a bit going for it right now, and it's going to continue on. And I've definitely gotten to stuff moving faster, but it just gets better and better in terms of how I'm projecting it out. So if I can deliver the same intensity throughout the whole thing and you like it already, it's getting better. It's going to get better. So if you like it now, it's likely that you will like it in the future as well. Our word of the week is Arcadian. Okay? Arcadian. Arcadian is technically a person from Arcadia, but it also means a person who lives a simple, quiet life. So rural, or if you're applying it to a different situation, not just a person, you can say rural, rustic, pastoral, suggesting a simple, innocent contentment. Okay, so Arcadian, a person who lives a simple, quiet life typically, or something that is rural, rustic, or pastoral in a simple and innocent kind of way. Our accidental essence, I'm going to actually be talking about, and I probably touched on something similar to this, but I'm going to be talking about what makes a story real, or anything in a story real for that matter. And I don't know, some people who've been writing a long time, if you're a skilled writer, if you've been writing for quite a long time and you've practiced this, you don't need to go through this stuff, but maybe there's some wisdom I have that I can impart to you. We all, when we read a story, we want to be immersed in the story, and I think that's a given. I think it's everybody would agree that if they read a book, they want the book to go quickly. Or they want it not necessarily to go quickly, but they want to forget the outside world. And this is the case in many forms of art that we take in on a regular basis. So if you watch a television show, you don't want to be constantly pulled out of the show. I watched the newer series of Unfortunate Events with Neil Patrick Harris. I think he produced it, right? He and the guy who wrote the books produced it, I believe. When they created the show, I think they did an excellent job. But my one critique of the show is that they kept on having jokes, right, that applied to the outside world, and it was a bit annoying to me because it kept on pulling me out of the story. And when I watch something, I don't like being pulled out of the story. This is why I typically don't like politics in stories, because politics typically have something to deal with. In a lot of stories, politics have something to deal with what is going on in the world currently, and they pull you outside the story. And when I read a book or when I watch a television show or watch a movie, my desire is to forget the world outside myself, and then I can get immersed in that story. So I might not watch something that is super political now, but I might watch something that does talk about politics from the past. So because I'm not directly connected to it, and there's not a hubbub about it and different things like that. Okay? So for example, I really like the show MASH. I realize that they're very anti-war in MASH because it was created in part during the Vietnam War, I believe. So there was a big anti-war bias toward the Vietnam War. And in MASH, when it probably wasn't the case in the Korean War, when people went over and fought the Korean War, it probably didn't have that same sentiment because in some sense, from what I understand from history, a big part of the Vietnam War ending was the fact that the people in the United States, there was just this dislike of the Vietnam War after a certain amount of time. And maybe that was good, maybe that was bad. I'm not making a political comment right now. It's just the case that if I existed at that time and there was this big hubbub around the Vietnam War, I probably wouldn't have liked MASH as much. And I know people who don't because of the politics within it. But at the same time, I can overlook a lot of the politics within that show, where I can't overlook certain politics in other shows or movies from this present day, and where I can't overlook certain messaging in movies because it pulls you out of the movie. And I'm too, as I've said in the past, I don't like politics generally, but I think it's a good thing to be up on and be aware of. So I'm aware of what's going on in politics, but I wish I wouldn't have to deal with them. So when it pulls me out of the show, politics are something that politics are things that are generally make a person unhappy. And the reason why we read books or watch movies or watch television shows or play video games or engage in other forms of art is because we want. Sorry, I'm cutting my head off, just adjusting my shirt. The reason why we do these things is because we often want to forget. We want that escapism. Some people think it should have this profound message about the world, but I think the majority of us writers, and I think the majority of those consuming media and consuming literature, consuming art in general, not just what we would consider media, but I think the majority of people consuming these things do them out of entertainment in a way that it'll allow them to transcend time and space to experience something they would not otherwise experience in a way they wouldn't have otherwise experienced it. This is why guys like action films, they tend to like action films, and this is why girls like romance, tend to like romance. Like, there can be there's definitely girls who like action films. There's definitely guys who like romance. We aren't going to talk about what that is here. We aren't going to talk about what that says about you as a male, right? I'm just kidding. No, actually, I think some romance movies are very, very good, and I don't know why I closed that. Some romance movies are very good and done very well. But they're both fantasies, right? These very big, hypermasculine action films are a male fantasy in a sense, and these romance movies are a female fantasy. Romance does not work the way it works in a movie, and action and in a lot of cases it's a war movie for guys. War doesn't work the way that it works in movies, right? Cop movies tend to not work in the same way. There's these aspects of the movie that are fantastical because of the way in which we react emotionally, and we wouldn't be reacting emotionally in that way if it were actually happening in the real world. For instance, in action movies, you're in danger a lot, and you respond to danger differently. I mean, there may be somebody who is a very big adrenaline junkie, but at the same time, the majority of people are not going to like that danger. What other people don't, what is often not presented in war movies as well, is the boredom that exists, and the fact that people are away from home and they're lonely and all these other things within them. Romance movies are fiction in large part because when you get into a relationship, relationships are up and down and they're difficult and they take a lot of work and they aren't always romantic. It is probably the beginning of a relationship that is romantic, and then after a certain amount of time, it takes a lot of work, and that work from the perspective of the person working isn't often romantic, and there are certainly times that are great, but life tends to get at everybody, and life tends to make things bittersweet in a lot of ways, and that's often the case when it comes to relationships as well. But yeah, it typically is the case that women like romance more than men. And this is easily seen by like a survey. Of course, there's going to be guys who enjoy certain romance films and stories, and if a story is written well enough, it can extend beyond just the group it's written for, I guess, that genre, the group that would typically read it. And there's certainly war stories that do, and there are certainly romance stories. But I'm not reading Nicholas Sparks, and most women aren't reading Eugene Sledge, right? So that's my whole point. But yeah, so when when we read a story, we want to be immersed in that story. And one thing that can pull us out of the story is the things that connect us to real life, right? So if we're reading about a story and it connects us to some issue in our life, then we start to think about that issue in our life, and then it drags us out of the story. It makes that story less enjoyable for us. Even if you have something going on in your life that is difficult and distracting, it's going to be harder to write. It's going to be harder to read. It's going to be harder to enjoy those things that you loved. But stories, I guess, any type of art that is excellent art is going to be better at pulling us into that art, okay? And you can put politics, you can put religion, you can put messaging in your stories if you are very, very skilled, right? You can put it in your stories and not let it get in the way of stories, and not let it get in the way of the enjoyment of the story if you're very, very skilled. I don't think most people are capable of doing that, and I don't think I am capable of doing that. I'm not saying I'm on a higher level or anything like that, but I think most people aren't capable of doing that. And I think most of the time when you see books that have overt politics in them, they tend to actually be subpar books in general. Heinlein, he's a science fiction author, so this probably happens with maybe it doesn't happen with men more. It probably happens with both sexes to the same degree. But what I noticed is that I read a lot of science fiction because I guess older science fiction that is very object focused and explains a lot of stuff. But I read a lot of science fiction, and Robert Heinlein, I think it's Robert Heinlein. I know the last name. I can't remember the first off the top of my head because I'm tired. But he presents politics in his books, and his ideas are very interesting. Right, his ideas are very interesting, and for example, Stormship Troopers. But at the same time, he's not the best. He doesn't draw me in because he's not that good of a writer. In the same way, other writers are able to draw me in. George Orwell, and some people hate George Orwell, and there's so many different variables that determine whether you like a book. But so many people hate George Orwell, but I believed in a lot of his books, he drew you in a way that other people didn't, all right? I just had a female author who was Ayn Rand, right? Ayn Rand, probably not the best writer, probably not the best storyteller. You have Atlas Shrugged, a very, very famous book, and she presents her political ideas in the book. Her political ideas. So she's presenting those ideas. These are authors that I would say are not skilled enough to present those ideas in a way where you forget about the ideas and you're able to take in the story, and you're able to take in the story first and foremost, right? When you read those books, it seems like the ideas come to the front, and maybe that's a error. Maybe that's something in my writing that is bad, right? Maybe my ideas come to the front more and I don't have the story front and center. And I certainly do need to work on storytelling. I think I think I do a good job of writing itself, but I think storytelling for me is something I need to work on. So yeah, you want people to be immersed. You want to experience it as real. And that's something that is confusing to say. You want somebody to experience a book as real, but that's not necessarily true. You want someone to buy into the book, if that makes sense, right? There's a difference between presenting something as real and presenting something that people can buy into. I think I've said this in the past, but the Nintendo, I like the company Nintendo because they take a lot of risks, and I'm a big fan of risk-taking in creativity, and I think Nintendo does a phenomenal job in general in doing that, and sometimes they crash and burn, and sometimes they have a home run, which seems to be the case with their newer systems and games, right? But one thing and I don't remember if it was one game designer, and I don't remember if it was that, or I don't remember if it was Nintendo in general, but one game designer, I believe, was saying, hey, we want this to be realistic, and I've talked about this in the past. We want this to be realistic, but not necessarily be realism. And the difference between realistic and realism is what I'm trying to get here. If I wanted to present the world in a if I wanted to present the world in a way that was realism within my books, I would just list information, right? I would try to give someone as much information as possible. I would try to describe things as completely as possible with as much detail as possible, so those people could see that what I'm talking about as clearly as possible. That's realism. If you're trying to make something realistic, so when you play a Nintendo game or whoever's creating the games, they wanted to focus on making something realistic, so something that feels true to reality. They wanted something that felt like an actual reality, even though if it didn't work exactly like actual reality, right? Realism is trying to copy reality exactly, but making something realistic isn't necessarily trying to get in all those details. For example, if you are painting, realism painting is often photorealistic, right? So if you take a picture, realistic painting is photorealistic, and it presents what's there. Realism, not realistic. These are just confusing terms. So a painting that is realism is photo accurate, right? A painting that is realistic presents something deeper. It presents reality more clearly, okay? So there is something to be said about things that are not realism, right? Things that do not look like actual reality. You can argue whether those are presenting things more realistically, but I think that things that aren't as realistic can present things as things that aren't as photorealistic, can present things as more in line with reality, if that makes sense. So I'm going to actually talk about Picasso, and I think there's one example of this that he does in a way that I do think he presents this in a realistic way, even though he does not use realism when he's doing it. And I'm not going to talk about his most famous paintings. A lot of his paintings are very famous. I'm going to talk about one that I've talked about in the past that has always stuck with me. I've just loved it. He has a painting, or maybe it's a series of paintings, and it's only about, each one is only about this big. And he did it like probably over 100 times. It was probably 150 times. And he painted a bowl, right? He painted a bowl, and he painted the bowl in 100 different ways, 100 plus different ways. And I think that you understand the form of a bowl and what a bowl is more when you look at his paintings as opposed to, maybe they were drawings actually, as opposed to a photograph. And the reason why you understand a bowl more is because you see this bowl in its most basic form. You see a bowl in like a twisted form. You see a bowl in a somewhat realistic form. You see a bowl in all these different forms. So you're looking at a different perspective, right? You're taking in the bowl from a different perspective every single time, which I think was his intention. I'm not sure. Maybe he just wanted to present it in different ways, but I think it might have been the case that he was trying to look at it from different perspectives. And because we each have a lens we look at things from, we all have different perspectives we look at things from which we look at things, right? And because of that, I think that he actually was more realistic in his presentation of what he was doing. So being realistic in your writing as opposed to realism, being realistic in your writing isn't necessarily listing every little tiny thing, okay? There is a disconnect between every little detail we see and what we put down on paper, and that's a good disconnect. There's a disconnect between, so if you put everything down on paper, the reader is going to read every little detail, but the reader's not going to understand what you're trying to convey. It's not going to work. So if you have ever drawn, or if you've done some serious drawing, you'll understand what I'm talking about more. I'm sorry, I'm really tired. So if I'm stuttering or if I'm going on about stuff a little bit, I've just hit a wall in terms of my energy right now. And that's why I'm drinking a lot of water. So if you've ever done any drawing, there is a difference between drawing what you think you see and drawing what you actually see. Okay, if you ever want to do something fun, you get somebody who doesn't know how to draw, and you're like, hey, I want you to draw something fairly difficult. I don't have anything weirdly shaped that would be difficult to draw. I want you to draw a human face. And it isn't very difficult to draw a fairly realistic human face. I've done it, and I did it pretty close to the beginning of my drawing that I've done in the past. So I asked somebody to draw a human face and watch them try to draw a human face. And they might draw like a cartoon face, but you tell them, no, actually draw a human face. Don't draw a cartoon face. And they'll try to draw it, but it'll look horrible. And one of the reasons why people have a hard time drawing a human face is because they're drawing what they think they're seeing and not what they're actually seeing. Okay? When you draw, you actually have to slow down. And you have to see the lines and things. So I'm going to use my face, for example, because if you can see it. So if you look at your face in the mirror, if you're looking at my face right now, here's a few things I notice. Right now, there's a line that goes down my face to this way. On the left side of the right side of my face, sorry, it's all mirrored because of this. On the left side of my face, on my nose, there's a patch that I would make the same color coming down, right? I would make my nostrils both black. I would make around my mouth, I would make that a little darker. And then I would make my forehead almost completely white. And there's all these lines. So there's all these different lines, and I'm breaking down my face into lines. You can also do this with your own face. But if you slow down, you start to notice all the lines. And instead of seeing the face you're looking at, whether it's my face or your own or just a photograph, instead of seeing those things as a face completely, you break it down into the most basic components that are its lines and shapes, right? Basic lines and shapes. And if you can break a face down into basic lines and shapes, you can do a good job of drawing that face with pencil and with a pencil, right? With shades of a pencil. Now, what I'm going to do is, if it's possible and you're watching the video, I'm actually going to make my face black and white if I can figure out how to do it. If I don't have to figure out how to do it, then you'll know. But if you look at a black and white photograph, it's going to make a lot more sense to you because you'll be able to see those contrasts of black and white a lot better. Okay, it makes more sense because you have the black, you have the white, you have the grayscale, and you're going to be able to see that better. But that's the difference between drawing what you see and draw what you actually see and what you think you see. But when you take in a human face, you take in the whole entire face, right? You don't take in little bits and pieces. You don't take in the face as you don't take in a human face as lines and shadow and form, right? You take in it as just a face, which is fine, which is how our brains work. And it's good our brains work that way, but you have to teach yourself how to think differently when you go about that. So what if we translate that into writing, okay? So when you write, you need to write what you actually see as opposed to what you think you are seeing, okay? You need to write translating that into writing, you need to write what your character is experiencing directly as opposed to what is everything that your character is experiencing in its sensory field or with the ears. So we take in tons of information a day through our eyes, through our nose, through our mouth if we're eating, and the taste and stuff like that, through our ears, through our skin, what we touch, but we don't perceive all of that. And if we did perceive all of that, we'd have a sensory overload. We'd probably go insane. There are people who have issues with touch, right? You know, there's people who are on the autism spectrum, and they have issues with senses. They have sensory issues. That's why if you ever work with kids with autism, there's sensory things they can use that help them calm down. There's heavy blankets that help them calm down because they're either trying to get more sensory input because they have a hard time with that, or they're trying to get less with the heavy blankets. I think that helps with less sensory input. So they're trying to get more or less. At the same time, so they have a hard time distinguishing between different sensory input in a lot of cases, not all. But when you are living your life, when you're going through your life, you may not have the same issues as them, but you're not taking in everything your senses are picking up, right? If I have a lamp right here. It's hot. It just hurt because I touched it. I have a lamp right here that I touched. It hurt. and if I pay attention to the lamp, that comes into my view. But if I start looking at the camera and I start talking, I don't even actually see the camera when I'm talking. I see the camera at first, and then after a while I forget about the camera and I start to visualize what's going on. I start to visualize talking to someone, and that takes up most of my sensory information. Sometimes I look down at my face, see my eyes are directed a little bit downward, and that's a little annoying because then I'm talking to my talking face. But everything that is happening in the room is not perceived by the character you are writing about. And some people may want to write about every little detail in the room, but even when you're writing about every little detail in the room, you have to realize that the person reading it cannot take in every little detail in the room and process it in a way that they can understand. So you need to either think through the character, right? And I just made that up. So thinking through the character is trying to see through the character's eyes and trying to present the world through the character's eyes in the way that they experience it. So for example, the human eye has this essentially 180 degree vision, right? 180 degree vision from my eyes. I can see out, right? If I put my eyes here, I can see my hands through my peripherals. If I put my hands there, so I have 180 degree vision, but I only see, you only see what? You have this cone of vision that you see, and it's only about 3% of your vision. So if you're writing and you're suddenly like, well, this person sees this and this and this and this, you have to present your character seeing certain things in a certain order, because your character, unless they're an alien, cannot physically, your character, unless that character is an alien, cannot physically see more than 3% of their vision at a time. They can only focus on about 3% of what they actually see, or somewhere around that number, like 3% of an angle at a time. So you have to move their vision to certain areas, right? I like to use space to my, what am I talking about? Space to my advantage. It's not that I didn't know what I was talking about. I just didn't know what the word I was trying to use. I didn't remember the word advantage. I like to use space to my advantage. So if you want to describe a character, maybe start with their top of their head, maybe start with their shoes, right? I actually apply this a little. I actually pull the concept out of this idea, but I'm going to go into that a little bit. So when you're going around a room and you're trying to describe a room, you need to group things together. You maybe need to do it geographically. Maybe you need to do it by different things that fit together, right? You're talking about the people in the room. You're talking about the room itself. You're talking about the different books in the room. You're talking about the noises. You can do it by senses, right? What does the character see? Then you group things by the sight. What does the character hear? What does the character smell? What does the character taste, if that's applicable, or what do they feel? If it's cold in the room, if it's hot in the room. And you can create a scene doing that, doing it step by step by step, right? Doing it sense by sense by sense. And you can do that geographically, and you can do that, group it by what people see or what people hear or what people smell. This is really fun if you take away a sense, right? I think something that is good to practice when you're writing, if you want to learn to write better, is to write using maybe one sense or two senses in a specific area, maybe for fun. Don't do it in an actual book, but take away the character being able to see something, right? Make the character blind and try to paint a world that is believable, that sucks people in with every other sense but sight. You can do this with hearing, right? You never mention what a person hears, you just mention that they see stuff, they smell stuff, they feel stuff, etc. You can do this with just sight if you want to. Sight is very powerful because if you can put a picture of something in somebody's head there, I think they're more likely to remember it if they can create that good picture. You can do it with feelings even, right? If you paint an emotional, something emotional, right? Feelings do exist, emotions do exist. We can put them into words, but maybe they're not necessarily words, right? But we can put them into words that people can understand. So if you want it to be a very emotional scene, you need to write in a way that explains what's going on emotionally. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you say, hey, this is what this person feels and this is what this person feels. You can write around the emotions by writing the dialogue in a way that directs the reader to understand the emotions of what's going on in the scene. And I guess that this brings me to the point I was going to make before that I wanted to wait on. So I like to pull out the concept behind the bigger concept, right? And the concept behind the bigger concept right now is that you are writing in a group. You're writing in a grouping. And what I was talking about before, the grouping that worked best before was actually the emotional grouping, okay, and how I was talking about it. So if I wanted to describe a room, I would typically not describe the whole room. I would typically, not always, doesn't always apply, but I would try to get the emotion of the room. And the emotion of the room doesn't need all the details. The emotion of the room could have 3 details. The emotion of the room could be described with 1 detail. For example, if I wanted to have someone understand this room to be a very like a professorial study, right? A professor's study, something that is very academic, and it's from the 1920s of a professor. I would probably have a character, I would possibly, maybe, I don't know, have a character who was smoking a pipe, right? And doing something in that room, such as reading a book, and then I would set that stage. Maybe I would have a fire, but I probably wouldn't present much other I wouldn't present many other things than that. Back to not being able to talk. Because there are certain, I don't know if you call them touchstones, but there are certain things that people connect to certain emotions, connect to certain ideas. There are certain things that people connect to being a professor or being studious or being a type of person that would be in a room with bookcases lining the walls and a leather chair and a roaring fire and a pipe that they're smoking, and the person would have a big beard, etc. And one of the things that might be the case is that their desk is completely clean, right? Or their desk is completely messy, because that would actually help set a tone. Another thing that would set a tone in that specific area is whether they have artifacts in the room, right? It might help tell what type of professor they are. In some cases, you don't need to present every little detail to tell about a specific person. You could tell a very specific detail, and you can tell it offhandedly, and that can tell a lot about a person. And I probably overdo it on the closing that again. And I probably overdo it on the details a lot when I'm doing this. I just probably overwrite, and then I need to cut back. I cut back tens of thousands of words on a draft. I think my last book I cut back 30,000 words. So it's a lot. Okay. I'm going to give you a few examples, and I'm going to be done because I'm fading right now. I'm a fan of less is more, as you can see. I'm a fan of presenting one detail and expounding on that detail as much as I can so people understand that detail before moving on to the next. And I'm always trying to present what I need without going overboard. Here are some details that I think really show the less is more concept. In the original Jurassic Park, there's water rippling, right? When you are first introduced to the T-Rex, there's the stomping, you hear this huge boom, 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 but you also see the water rippling in the cup. And later on, they also have water rippling in the puddle as well. But in the cup, it describes that it's saying that there's a creature so big, so massive, that it's making water ripple because it's actually creating a little bit of an earthquake, okay? And that is a really tiny little detail. Water rippling in a cup. You have the sound, you have the water rippling. That's it. It doesn't show how big the T-Rex is in the film. I really like the first Jurassic Park a lot, so I might be a little biased. But it never shows the T-Rex at that point. It just shows the water rippling beforehand. And in some ways, it creates this great amount of tension. Another less is more type situation is the standoff in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where it's jumping from everybody's eyes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And And in that situation, it just has the eyes, right? It has the strip of the eye, and it's showing the intensity of everybody before, and it's waiting who's going to shoot first. And it conveys this idea that everybody is keeping their eyes on everybody else, and they're waiting for another person to shoot, right? They're waiting for another person to shoot, because the person who shoots first loses, and everybody knows that in that scene. And I guess the final thing that I'd like to say, and this is related a little bit, but not directly, is that slow down. I think that slowing down when you write and focusing on something small like this can help you a lot. Slow down, have patience, because writing, like drawing, requires you to slow down and see the world as it is, and not just all the little details that you are seeing around you. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you, let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things he's doing, creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website, check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places. All right. So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.